The storm had rolled past hours ago, leaving the canyon heavy with the scent of wet dust and the echo of dripping water from the high rocks. Wyatt Kane guided his horse carefully along the narrow, slick trail, the mud clinging to the hooves, the weight of his soaked cavalry coat dragging on his shoulders. He hadn't meant to ride this far. There was no herd to check, no reason for a man to be wandering after a storm like this, except maybe to outrun the silence that haunted his empty home. Out here, the quiet felt thicker, safer. The ghosts couldn't follow him into the wild. Then something caught his eye, a patch of color down among the rocks. At first he thought it was a scrap of cloth torn loose by the wind. But then it moved. Wyatt narrowed his eyes, slid from the saddle and walked closer, boots sinking into the wet clay. The storm had carved gullies into the ground, left branches and stones scattered everywhere. Half buried in the debris lay a woman, bloodied, torn, her dress, once adorned with beads and feathers, now ruined by mud and rain. Her skin glowed faintly bronze beneath the grime, her black hair plastered to her cheek. For a moment, Wyatt thought she was dead. Her lips were colorless, her chest still. Then, barely, she breathed. He froze, jaw tightening, rifle shifting on his shoulder. He'd buried enough bodies in his life. 2 graves behind his cabin were proof of what happened when a man tried to save someone. His wife Eliza had gone cold with fever. His boy Luke had coughed himself into silence. Since then, Wyatt had learned one thing: digging was all he was good for. But still, he didn't move. He just stood there staring down at her. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath, the first word he'd spoken all day. He slung the rifle over his back and knelt beside her. Her arms were torn from the rocks, her ankles swollen. Every shallow breath looked like a battle. Even under the mud, her dress shimmered faintly, crafted with care. This wasn't some runaway or drifter. When his hand brushed her shoulder, her eyes flickered open. Dark. Defiant. Afraid. She tried to speak, but only a dry rasp came out. "Easy," Wyatt said, voice hoarse. "You're not dying out here." She blinked once, slow, doubtful. Then her eyes slid closed again. Wyatt hesitated, then slid his arms beneath her and lifted her gently. She was light, but limp in his grasp, like someone who had already lost too much. His horse snorted at the scent of blood, but Wyatt calmed it, laid her carefully across the saddle and mounted behind her. One arm steadying her, he turned toward home. The trail was slick, the canyon steep. Every hoofbeat echoed like a heartbeat in the dark. He thought of the fever nights of holding his boy outside under cold stars, praying for mercy that never came, of digging through frozen ground while the wind howled like judgment. He'd sworn never to carry another soul. Yet here he was, her fragile weight pressed against his chest. By the time the cabin came into view, the last light had bled from the sky. The lantern in the window flickered weakly. Wyatt's jaw ached from being clenched so long. He lifted her down, boots sinking deep in the mud, pushed the door open with his shoulder. The air inside smelled of smoke leather and loneliness. He laid her on the narrow bed, the same one he hadn't touched since burying Eliza and Luke. For a moment he just stood there, staring at her, still-formed chest rising and falling too fast. He didn't know why he'd brought her home. Maybe he didn't want to watch another body fade into the dirt. When her breath hitched uneven and fragile, he moved without thinking. Hanging his coat on the peg by the door, Wyatt fetched water from the basin. The ghosts would have to wait. There was someone alive here, and that was enough for now. He tore an old rag into strips, cleaning the blood from her skin with slow, steady hands. His mind was a tangle of thoughts he didn't want to face. When he finally finished, she lay still, her breathing shallow, but even her face calm beneath the dim light. The fire crackled low in the stove, its glow washing across the small cabin. Wyatt Kane sat at the table, his back to the bed, rubbing a hand over the stubble on his jaw. He told himself it was just for the night that come morning he'd figure out what to do. But deep down he already knew he wouldn't be letting her die out here. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, carrying the damp scent of the storm's aftermath. Wyatt stayed awake long after he should have slept, staring at the orange flicker in the stove door. Behind him, the woman lay stretched across the bed, her breaths uneven, but alive. He'd cleaned and bandaged the worst of her wounds, set her ankle as best he could, but questions gnawed at him harder than the work itself. Who was she? What was she running from? Was someone out there searching for her right now? The blanket slipped low across her frame, and for a moment he thought about fixing it, but stopped himself. He hadn't touched another woman since Eliza died, and even now the idea felt like trespassing on holy ground. Still, he couldn't ignore the beads and feathers sewn into her torn dress. He'd seen enough Apache handiwork in his time to recognize its meaning. He kept his thoughts to himself, leaned back in the chair, and eventually dozed off. Boots, still on rifle, resting against the table leg. It wasn't sleep, not really. More like drifting in and out, haunted by the fallen shadows that never left him. A faint sound pulled him back, a low groan. Dawn light was already pushing through the cracks in the window when Wyatt opened his eyes. She was awake, dark eyes peering at him from beneath a tangle of hair. When she tried to sit up, pain folded her back against the mattress with a gasp. Wyatt rose, crossed the room, and poured water from the pitcher into a tin cup. He held it out, but she only stared, cautious and still. "It's water," he said, voice rough with sleep. "That's all." Her eyes stayed on him, measuring what kind of man he was. Finally, her trembling hand lifted, fingers scraped and raw, and she took the cup. She drank slowly, each swallow careful, then handed it back without a word. "You'll need food," he muttered, taking a strip of dried venison from the shelf. He laid it on a plate and set it near her. She didn't touch it, just watched him. He understood. Out here, trust wasn't handed out easy. Wyatt sat down again, facing her across the fire's glow. "You're safe for now," he said quietly. "Storm's over. I won't ask questions tonight." Her lips parted as if to speak, but only a rasp escaped. She pressed her fingers to her throat, eyes tightening with pain, and turned away. Wyatt exhaled slowly. He remembered the sound of his boy Luke fighting for air during the fever. But this woman, she wasn't dying. Not yet. Later, when he thought she'd drifted off, she shifted, pulling the blanket tighter around her. Wyatt noticed again the craftsmanship of her dress, the beadwork deliberate, the colors meaningful. She wasn't just some lost wanderer. She carried a story, and stories like hers always drew danger. He stepped outside into the gray morning. The air was sharp, the ground slick. Smoke curled from the chimney as he filled the water bucket, checked the corral, and gave his horse a gentle pat. Routine chores, the kind that used to fill quiet mornings, but this time they felt different. Someone else was breathing under his roof now. When he came back in, she was awake, watching him. The plate had moved slightly, though the food remained untouched. He didn't mention it. He just sat, took out his knife, and began mending a cracked saddle strap, his movements slow and deliberate. She studied him like a wild creature trapped between fear and defiance. Finally, her voice broke the silence, a rough whisper, but clear enough. "Why?" He looked up. "Why what? Why did you bring me here?" The question hung between them, heavy as smoke. Wyatt stared at her, his jaw tightening. He thought of the graves outside, the vows he'd made to stop caring, to stop carrying burdens that could crush him again. "I couldn't leave you there," he said at last. She held his gaze a moment longer, then lowered her eyes. "No thanks. No trust. But no more questions either." Wyatt finished his repair, set the knife aside, and went to check her bandages once more, his hands steady, his heart far less so. When Wyatt adjusted the bandage around her arm, his fingers barely brushed her skin. She tensed, eyes flicking open for an instant, and he pulled back immediately, respectful of the space she guarded so fiercely. Still in that brief touch, he noticed the strength beneath the bruises, a will that hadn't broken. The day crawled by. Wyatt cooked a pot of beans, left a portion for her by the fire, and spent the rest of the daylight working through the woodpile outside. Each time he came back in, she was sitting a little straighter, silent but alert, her dark eyes tracking the flames as if they could answer her unspoken fears. When she finally began to eat, careful bite by bite, he pretended not to see. Her trust, if it ever came, had to come freely. By nightfall, the cabin no longer felt empty. 2 people breathed within those walls now, their silences meeting somewhere in the middle. Wyatt didn't ask who she was, and she didn't volunteer a name. He lay down on the floor near the stove rifle beside him, the firelight flickering across the ceiling beams. Questions churned in his mind, hers, and the kind that might soon arrive on horseback. But sleep claimed him before the answers did. His last thought before drifting off was simple and sharp. He'd broken his vow. He hadn't left her to die in that canyon, and now she was here. Whatever peace he'd carved out for himself was gone for good. Morning came pale and cold. Wyatt rose before dawn, his shoulders stiff from another night on the hard floor. He moved quietly, boots soft on the worn boards, careful not to wake her, though he doubted she'd slept much. He'd heard her shifting restlessly in the dark, fighting pain and fear both. Outside, the air bit sharp with the smell of wet earth and pine. He hauled water from the well-chopped kindling, fed the horse, and let the rhythm of habit steady him. When he stepped back into the cabin, the fire had caught again, filling the room with the scent of smoke and damp wood. The woman, he still didn't know her name, was sitting up against the wall, dark hair loose around her shoulders. She didn't look fragile anymore. Her gaze followed him with a quiet steadiness that made him pause. "You're awake early," he said, his voice low. She didn't answer, only watched as he poured water into the basin and washed his hands. The silence between them was thick, but it no longer felt like the emptiness of strangers. It was something heavier, an understanding neither had put into words. He set a pot of beans to boil and placed a piece of bread beside it. After a moment's thought, he set another plate across the table. For years, that table had known only one man's supper. The other chair had gathered dust like the graves outside. Now there were 2 plates, and the weight of it settled deep in his chest. She hesitated before moving, every motion careful because of her injured ankle. He almost stood to help, but stopped himself. Pride, he knew, was something worth letting a person keep. She made it to the table on her own, lowering herself slowly. Her dress was still torn, where his rough stitching held it together. The beadwork along the edges caught the morning light. He recognized it again for what it was, Apache craft, meaning heritage, not just survival. He said nothing. She broke a piece of bread, then quietly placed half on his plate before eating her share. The small gesture caught him off guard. He'd given her food because that's what a man does when someone's starving. She gave some back, not out of need, but out of choice. He nodded slightly. No smile, just a softening around the eyes. They ate in silence, the sound of tin scraping wood, and the low whistle of wind slipping through the walls. Her gaze met his more than once, curious but cautious, as though trying to understand why he hadn't sent her away. "You live alone?" she finally asked, her voice rough but steadier. "Yes," he said. He didn't explain the graves outside, said enough. But she waited, and the weight of her silence pressed him to add, "Had a wife. A boy." Fever took them. Her expression didn't twist with pity, which surprised him. She just nodded slow as if she knew that kind of loss herself. That was enough. "And you?" he asked, keeping his tone even. She looked away, her fingers tightening around the crust of bread. For a long time she said nothing. Then softly, "I cannot say." It wasn't a lie, he could hear the truth folded inside it, sharp with danger. Wyatt knew better than to push. He leaned back in his chair, resting one calloused hand on the table, and let it be. The air between them was heavy again, but this time it didn't feel like distance. It felt like something waiting to change. Later that morning, while Taya Moonfeather rested, Wyatt Kane headed out to check the fence line. The storm had loosened one of the rails, and he worked in silence, hammering nails into the damp wood, the smell of wet pine clinging to the air. From where he stood, he could see the distant ridge of the canyon, a stretch of land that made his gut tighten. Riders had crossed that way before bounty hunters, scouts, men, who chased coin and blood in equal measure. If anyone was looking for her, they wouldn't stop at the canyon. They'd come this way sooner or later. When Wyatt stepped back inside the cabin, felt different. The faint scent of wood smoke and simmering beans filled the room. She'd managed to rise, stoked the fire, even thickened the stew pot on the stove. Without asking, she had folded herself into his space, quiet but certain. He noticed his tin cup had been refilled and set neatly at his place on the table. "You shouldn't be on that ankle," he said. Taya met his eyes, steady and sure. "I can stand." There was no defiance in her tone, just truth. He almost argued, but something in her voice stopped him. She wasn't trying to prove strength, she was trying to belong. Wyatt respected that. That night they ate in silence. When his hand brushed hers as he passed the plate, neither of them moved away too quickly. The quiet between them had changed. It wasn't hollow anymore. It carried weight, an uneasy peace built on unspoken trust. Before lying down on the floor again, Wyatt checked the rifle beside him, his gaze drifting to the window. Someone would come looking for her, that much he knew. But the choice had already been made the night he carried her out of that canyon. Whatever her secrets, whatever trouble she dragged behind her, she was under his roof now. And he wasn't the kind of man to turn his back on that. By the fourth evening, the rhythm of the cabin had shifted in ways Wyatt hadn't expected. The days passed with quiet work, cutting wood, drawing water, cooking simple meals, and yet every task felt changed because she was there. She hadn't told him her name, and he hadn't pressed her, but her presence filled every corner that had once echoed with his solitude. He caught himself noticing small things, the way she studied the room, like she was memorizing it, the way her fingers lingered on the beadwork of her torn dress, as if it tethered her to a world she'd lost. Sometimes, when she thought he wasn't looking, her gaze drifted toward the graves outside. That evening the cold bit harder, as the sun sank behind the hills. Wyatt brought in extra logs, stacking them by the stove, and fed the flames until the cabin glowed warm. She sat nearby, her injured ankle propped on the bed, her long black hair unbound and spilling over her shoulders. He had given her Eliza's old shawl, a simple wool wrap frayed at the edges but still warm. She hadn't asked for it, and she hadn't refused. When he moved past her, she stirred, trying to rise. "I can help," she said, her voice steadier than before. "Stay off that foot," he replied, firm but gentle. "It won't heal if you push it." Her jaw set with quiet pride, but she obeyed, sinking back into the chair. The firelight danced across her face, catching the soft shine of her hair, and Wyatt forced himself to look away, pretending to focus on sharpening his axe blade. The silence stretched long, heavy, but not hostile. Then she spoke her words, careful. "Those graves outside. Wife and child." Wyatt's hand paused on the blade. "Yes." She didn't speak for a while, then said softly, "The way you look at them, it isn't just grief. It's guilt." He let out a long breath, setting the blade aside. "Maybe both. I should have done more. Should have seen the fever coming, ridden for medicine sooner. But there are things a man can't fight. Doesn't stop him from wishing he could have. Taya said nothing. She just listened, no pity, no false comfort. And somehow that eased the ache in his chest more than words ever could. When silence settled again, it was lighter this time. Wyatt glanced up and saw her fingers idly twisting the fringe of the shawl. "You haven't told me who you are," he said. Her eyes flicked to him, then away. "If I tell you, you'll send me away." His jaw tightened. "I carried you out of that canyon. Doesn't matter whose daughter you are, you're here now." She studied him for a long moment, as if weighing the truth of his words. Finally she whispered, "My name is Taya." It hit him harder than he expected, that name, simple, soft, and strong. She didn't say more, but the beadwork on her dress and the guarded look in her eyes told him enough. She wasn't some runaway. She belonged to a people, the Red Wolf tribe, and men would surely come for her. The fire cracked between them, its light flickering like a promise neither of them yet understood. Wyatt Kane sat down on the bench beside the stove. The warmth from the fire painting flickers of light across the cabin walls. Taya Moonfeather met his gaze. Neither of them speaking, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other. The fire's glow made the air between them heavy, too close, too real. Wyatt finally looked down at his hands, rough and scarred, as if the calluses could protect him from what stirred beneath his chest. When she tried to stand testing her ankle, she faltered. Instinct took over before thought did. Wyatt was beside her in 2 strides, steadying her with one hand beneath her arm. She tensed, her breath catching, but didn't pull away. His hand lingered a moment longer than it should have before he helped her back to the bed. "Thank you," she murmured, her tone quiet even, but carrying something beneath the surface that hit him harder than any blow he'd taken in his life. That night, for the first time, they didn't eat in silence. Taya asked about the land, how long he'd lived there, what crops he grew, what stock he kept. Her questions were simple, but they mattered. They reminded him what it felt like to be human again. He answered her plain and honest, his words carrying the grit of truth and the ache of memory. Talking about small things, about soil, rain, and horses, felt like crossing a bridge he thought had long burned behind him. When the fire burned low, she settled back against the bed, pulling Eliza's old shawl tight around her shoulders. Wyatt stretched out on the floor near the stove, one arm under his head rifle at his side. The quiet had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full of something unsaid, something fragile, that neither dared disturb. Before sleep took him, he heard her whisper through the dark, "You didn't have to bring me here." He turned toward her shadowed shape, voice soft but steady. "Maybe not," he said, "but I couldn't leave you." She didn't answer, only breathed easier, as though his words had given her more warmth than the fire could. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. Inside, the silence stayed warm, alive, and no longer lonely. The days that followed carried a strange weight, slower somehow. Every sound inside the cabin chairs, scraping tin, clinking, the soft rustle of Taya shifting in bed, reminded Wyatt that the place no longer belonged to silence alone. She was still guarded, still holding her secrets tight, but her presence filled the cabin like smoke after a dying fire, impossible to ignore. The morning after she'd spoken her name, Wyatt sat at the table, needle and thread in hand, clumsily stitching the torn hem of her dress. His fingers weren't made for such work, more used to axes than sewing, but he worked with patience, jaw set in quiet focus. He'd thought about offering her one of Eliza's old dresses, folded neatly in the chest by the wall, but it didn't feel right. Those belonged to ghosts, not to this woman. So he mended what was hers. Thread through torn hide, crooked stitches holding against the wear. Taya sat across from him, silent. At first, her eyes held suspicion, as if she expected him to treat her as others had, with distance or cruelty. But as time passed, her gaze softened. When he handed the dress back, his large, rough hands brushed against the delicate beadwork. She took it gently, nodding once without a word, folding the fabric with care that spoke louder than any thank you. That evening she wore it again. The stitches were uneven, but they held. When she carried a bowl of beans to the table, Wyatt noticed how the mended fabric hugged her shape, how the neckline dipped slightly where it had torn. He turned away quickly, focusing on the steam curling from the bowl, but when their fingers brushed, neither pulled away too soon. Her ankle was nearly healed now. She walked slowly, leaning on the wall when she needed to, refusing to sit idle. She tended the fire, refilled his cup without asking, smoothed the blanket when he wasn't looking. Small things. But they brought life back to the cabin, a life he hadn't felt since before Luke's laughter went quiet. In return, Wyatt found himself making small offerings of his own. He fixed the chair she favored so it wouldn't wobble, carved a new handle for the broken wooden spoon, split more wood than he needed. The pile outside grew high, like he was building a fortress against the world. One night after supper, they lingered longer at the table. The fire threw soft shadows across her face, her dark eyes reflecting the flame. "Why stay here?" she asked. So far from town, Wyatt's voice was steady. "Because towns are full of men who take what ain't theirs. Out here, a man answers to himself." She studied him, her gaze thoughtful, then gave a slow nod. "I understand." He wondered what ghosts chased her into that canyon, but he didn't ask. Truth had a way of finding daylight on its own. As he passed her a cup of water, their knuckles brushed again. This time her hand didn't move away. Her fingers lingered against his calloused skin, her dark eyes holding his across the flicker of firelight. The air between them stilled, quiet, dangerous, alive. It lasted no longer than a heartbeat before Taya Moonfeather stepped back, but the air between them stayed taut like a thread stretched too tight to break. That night, lying on the floor near the stove, Wyatt Kane found himself staring at the rafters longer than usual. His thoughts tangled around the sound of her voice, the way she mirrored his quiet, and how her presence had changed the very air inside his cabin. Her name, Taya, turned over in his mind like a secret he had no right to keep. She was no longer a stranger. Her name carried weight, history, and blood. Her torn dress stitched with beads and feathers spoke of her people and the life she'd left behind. Wyatt hadn't asked her to tell him who she truly was. He didn't need to. Her strength, her silence told him everything he needed to know. When dawn came, he rose before she did, pulling on his boots and stepping into the cold morning air. The sky was pale and wide, and his breath hung in the chill. Smoke curled from the chimney behind him, rising soft against the gray sky. For the first time in years, when he looked back at his cabin, he didn't see a hollow shelter built for one man. It looked alive again, like something worth protecting. When he stepped inside, she was standing by the fire, her dark hair loose, holding the mended dress to her chest, as if it gave her strength. In that moment, he understood the choice he'd made in that canyon wasn't just mercy. It was the beginning of something he couldn't undo. By the 6th day, the air around the cabin had shifted again. Nothing looked different, yet Wyatt felt it deep in his gut, a pressure, a sense that the world beyond his fence line had begun to stir. He'd lived too long on the edge of men and their violence not to recognize the scent of trouble. Taya felt it too. Her ankle was stronger now. She moved carefully but with purpose, stepping outside in the mornings, the shawl wrapped around her shoulders as she faced the pale light. She didn't wander far, just to the well or to the 2 wooden markers on the hill. Wyatt saw her once crouched beside the graves, her hand resting on the earth as if she were listening. She rose quickly when she noticed him watching, but he said nothing. He understood grief. Neither of them could ignore the sound that had begun to echo faintly in the distance, hoofbeats along the ridge. Twice Wyatt had heard riders moving where no one usually rode, voices carried faint on the wind. Men didn't travel that path unless they were hunting something or someone. He started keeping his rifle close, leaning it against the wall, instead of leaving it in the corner. That evening after supper, Taya finally asked the question hanging between them. "Do you think they're looking for me?" Wyatt met her eyes. "I'd wager they are." Her jaw tightened. "Then you should send me away before they find me here." "No," he said the word sharp and certain. "I carried you out of that canyon. You're here now. I'm not handing you over." She stared at him, voice barely above a whisper. "You don't know what I am." "I know enough," he said, his tone steady but unyielding. For a long time she just looked at him, her eyes flickering with conflict, fear, guilt, and something else he couldn't name. Then she lowered her gaze, silent. The fire crackled between them, and the quiet that followed was heavy with choices neither could take back. Later, as Wyatt worked the edge of his knife against the whetstone, the sound filled the room with a slow rhythm. Taya sat across from him, sewing the seam of her dress with steady hands. The light from the fire shimmered over her fingers, her movements calm but tense, like someone bracing for what might come. When Wyatt stepped outside, the sky had turned black and endless stars sharp against the cold. He stood on the porch, listening. The faint thud of hooves reached his ears again. There, then gone. His hand rested on the rifle strapped across his shoulder. Trouble was coming. He could feel it. When he finally went back inside, Taya was still awake, sitting by the fire. Her hair fell freely over her shoulders, her face bathed in gold light. She looked up at him, not with fear, but with a quiet defiance, as if daring the world to try and take from her again. "You should get some rest," Wyatt said quietly. "I can't sleep," she answered. "Not when men like that are near." He nodded. He didn't sleep easy either, not for years. He lay down on the floor near the stove rifle within arm's reach, the fire casting restless shadows across the walls. As the night deepened, his thoughts circled her, who she was, why men hunted her, what danger she had brought to his door. Yet as the wind whispered through the cracks of the cabin, he realized the answers didn't matter. What mattered was that she was here alive under his roof, because he had chosen to save her. And for the first time in years, that choice made him feel alive too. As Wyatt Kane's eyes drifted shut, the last thing he heard was Taya Moonfeather's quiet whisper, soft enough to be meant only for him. "You shouldn't risk yourself for me." He didn't answer. But the hard set of his jaw, lit by the faint firelight, carried all the truth he needed to say. The risk had already been taken, and he wasn't the kind of man to take it back. The morning after the riders passed along the ridge, the silence inside the cabin felt heavier. Wyatt rose early, tugged on his boots, and stepped into the cold dawn. The sky was pale as bone, and his breath smoked in the air like a warning. The earth still held the damp scent of the last storm as he walked the perimeter, checking the fence line, scanning the trees, the ridges, every hollow that could hide a man with a rifle. Nothing moved but the wind. Still, unease sat deep in his chest, like a buried bullet. He'd seen enough ambushes to know men could wait for days if they wanted something bad enough. When he came back inside, Taya was sitting at the table, the shawl wrapped around her shoulders, steam rising from the tin cup she'd set out for him. Her dark hair fell loose down her back, gleaming in the dim light. "You heard them again," she said quietly. Wyatt nodded, setting his rifle within arm's reach near the door. "Close enough." Her fingers tightened around the edge of her shawl. "They won't stop. Let them try," he replied, his voice flat, but carrying more weight than the words themselves. They ate in silence, the beans thick in the pot, the bread gone hard around the edges. Between them the air was heavy, not with fear, but with something unspoken. Taya's eyes searched his face in the flicker of firelight, tracing the rough lines of his jaw, the worn strength in his hands. Finally, she spoke again. "You carry ghosts with you," she said. "Not just the ones buried outside." Wyatt froze the spoon halfway to his mouth. He hadn't told her about the war. The screams in the night, the flashes of cannon fire, the faces of men torn apart in fields soaked red. He swallowed hard, setting the spoon down slowly. "War leaves its marks," he said after a moment. "Some you see, some you don't." Taya didn't flinch. She rose slowly and crossed to where he sat. Her steps were careful, her shawl trailing like smoke behind her. When she reached him, her fingers brushed the long scar across his forearm, the one carved there by shrapnel years ago. Her touch was light but steady, lingering longer than it needed to. "You think you're broken," she whispered. "But you're not." Wyatt's chest tightened. He had buried his pain in silence for years, pretending hard work and solitude could bury grief deep enough to forget. But her words cut through the armor he'd built, quiet, simple, true. He didn't speak. He only raised his hand, rough and calloused, to cover hers. Neither moved for a long time. The fire cracked softly. The wind rattled the shutters, and their eyes locked across the small space between them. She withdrew first, but slow, like she wasn't pulling away from fear, but from something that scared her more than danger ever could. When she sat again, her shoulders carried a different kind of strength. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was staying. She was. As the day passed, the tension outside grew sharper. They both felt it like a storm building at the edge of the horizon. When the chores were done and the light dimmed, Taya came to sit near the fire, threading sinew through the loose beads that had fallen from her dress. Her hands were steady, but her eyes were far away. Finally, she spoke. "I'm the daughter of a chief," she said quietly. "They hunt me because they believe they can use me, trade me for gold or for power. If they find me here, they'll kill you too." Wyatt didn't blink. His voice came low and calm. "Then they'll have to try." "You shouldn't choose this," she said, her tone cracking just slightly. He leaned forward, eyes steady. "I already did. That night in the canyon, I chose." Her gaze met his, dark and glistening in the firelight. Whatever wall she had built to survive began to crumble. She set aside the beads, moved closer, and rested her hand on his shoulder. No more words followed. None were needed. When her head came to rest lightly against his arm, Wyatt didn't move away. His hand found hers, fingers curling, slow, deliberate, a promise made without speaking. It wasn't a gesture of passion, but of something far rarer in a world like theirs trust. That night, Taya Moonfeather slept deeper than she had since the storm. Her breathing evened her body, finally relaxing under the old shawl. Wyatt lay on the floor near the stove, eyes open, watching the last of the fire fade to embers. For the first time in years, the fallen shadows in his mind were quiet. And in that silence he realized he was no longer carrying his ghosts alone. Outside, the shadows of men still lingered along the ridge, but they hadn't yet dared to come closer. Inside the cabin, the fragile bond between two scarred souls had hardened into something stronger, something that might just withstand whatever waited beyond the hills. By late afternoon, the storm rolled in from the west, stacking black clouds high over the horizon. The air grew thick and restless, humming with tension. Wyatt Kane knew this kind of weather well. Storms in these parts didn't come to whisper, they came to test a man's walls. He worked fast, hauling every stick of wood he could carry, stacking it high beside the stove until his arms ached. When the first drops began to lash the ground, he shut the door tight, sealing them in against the howling wind. The cabin dimmed, lit only by firelight flickering across the walls as the rain hammered the roof like angry fists. Taya Moonfeather sat at the table. Her shawl pulled close, the strand of beads she'd been repairing now set aside. She watched him move steady, deliberate, the way his hand never strayed far from the rifle, the way his jaw tightened at every roll of thunder. She didn't need to ask. She knew the danger outside wasn't just the storm. When lightning flashed across the window, bright as gunfire, she flinched, her hand tightening around the fabric at her chest. Wyatt noticed. He set down the axe blade he'd been oiling and said quietly, "Roof'll hold. I patched it last spring." Taya's eyes flicked to his. "It isn't the storm I fear." He didn't need her to explain. Riders on the ridge, men hunting a bounty, or worse. He leaned forward, his hands braced against the table, voice steady. "If they come, they'll find I don't move easy." Something softened in her gaze, not pity, but the kind of understanding that goes deeper than words. For the first time in years, Wyatt felt the walls of the cabin weren't the only thing offering him shelter. Hours crawled by. The storm raged outside, rattling the shutters, shaking the door, roaring like a living thing. Inside, the fire cracked and spat, fighting to hold its ground. Taya drifted closer from the table to the bed, then finally to the bench near Wyatt. It wasn't planned. The storm simply pressed them nearer, as if the world outside demanded they share its defiance. When she shivered, Wyatt grabbed another blanket and draped it across her shoulders. His hand brushed her arm, lingered for a heartbeat longer than it should have before he pulled back. She looked up at him, firelight dancing across her face, her lips parting as though she wanted to speak. But no sound came. Wyatt shifted, restless. He'd buried touch years ago, buried warmth and closeness in the same dirt that covered Eliza and Luke. But something about her presence, quiet, steady, alive, stirred it all back to the surface. He turned away, eyes fixed on the flames. Then her voice came soft through the sound of rain. "Why do you stay near me? You could have sent me away." He met her gaze, his face shadowed by the firelight. "Because I've buried enough. Leaving you in that canyon would have been the same as digging another grave myself." The words settled heavy between them. She shifted closer, her shoulder brushing his arm. Lightning lit the room again, catching her face for just a breath before plunging it back into shadow. Then slowly her hand reached out, hesitant, but sure, and rested on his. He didn't pull away. His rough fingers turned and closed around hers, steady and warm. Their eyes locked across the fire, the world outside falling away, until only the two of them remained. The first kiss came not in hunger, but in stillness after the storm had stripped everything else bare. Taya leaned in her lips, brushing his hesitant at first, then certain when he didn't move. His hand rose to her cheek, rough against soft skin, holding her, as if anchoring himself to something real. It didn't last long, just enough to speak what neither dared to say aloud. All the unspoken things between them, the shared meals, the mended cloth, the silence they'd turned into comfort, breathed into that moment. When they parted, their foreheads rested together, their breath mingling with smoke and thunder. "You don't know what will come," she whispered. "I know enough," he said simply. Her exhale came slow, trembling like a release she'd held too long. The fear that had followed her since the canyon finally loosened its grip. That night, she lay on the bed, the blanket drawn close, but her hand drifted to the floor close enough for his to find it. Their fingers brushed, lingered, and held. Outside, the storm raged without mercy. But inside the cabin, the silence had changed again. It wasn't the silence of strangers, nor the kind born of survival. It was the quiet of two people who had already chosen without words not to let go. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving the land raw and soaked the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and smoke. Wyatt stepped out into the morning boots, sinking in the mud rifle slung across his shoulder. The hills were still, but his world was no longer the same. He scanned the ridge the way he always did at first light, but this morning felt different. He didn't have to strain to hear it this time. Hoofbeats. Faint but steady, carrying through the damp ground like a warning. Whoever had been circling for days wasn't hiding anymore. They were coming down. When Wyatt Kane stepped back inside, Taya Moonfeather was already awake, standing near the fire with her shawl pulled tight. Her dark eyes lifted to him. She didn't need to ask. She'd felt it too. "They're near," she said softly. "They are," he answered, setting the rifle beside the door and checking the chamber with a practiced motion. She drew a slow breath, her hands trembling just once before she steadied herself. "If they see me here, they won't leave without me. Then they'll have to try." "You should go," she insisted. Wyatt shook his head once. "I don't run." Her jaw clenched. "You don't understand. To them, I'm not a woman. I'm a prize. A chief's daughter means power. They'll trade my blood for their gain. If you stand with me, they'll kill you too." "I understand more than you think," he said, voice rough but sure. "I buried my wife and boy in this dirt, and I stayed. You think I'd hand you over now after dragging you out of that canyon I told you before? I chose." The fire popped, filling the silence. For a heartbeat, she looked as though she wanted to argue, but her shoulders fell instead. She stepped closer, her hand brushing his arm. "Then you must be ready," she said quietly. By mid-morning, they came. 4 riders broke through the mist at the edge of the clearing, their coats slick with mud rifles slung over their shoulders. The leader, a heavy man with a scar carving his cheek, raised a hand and stopped his horse. His voice carried low but cold across the wet ground. "We're looking for an Apache girl. Young, dark hair, wounded. Heard she came this way." Wyatt stood in the doorway, the rifle steady in his grip, his frame blocking the entrance. "Ain't no one here but me." The scarred man smirked, spitting into the mud. "Funny. Tracks say otherwise." "Tracks lie," Wyatt said flatly. The man tilted his head. "We can look for ourselves, or you can hand her over now and save yourself the trouble." Inside, Taya stood just beyond the doorway, hidden in the shadows, her hand clutched around the edge of the shawl. Her pulse thudded in her throat, but her face stayed calm, resigned. She had always known this moment would come. Wyatt didn't move. His voice came low and certain. "No one here but me. And no one crosses this line." The scarred man's grin faded. He nodded to one of his men, a wiry rider with cold eyes, who swung off his horse and started forward, mud sucking at his boots. "We'll see about that." Wyatt cocked the rifle. The click of the hammer echoed through the clearing. "One more step," he said, "and you'll see what you don't want to." The man froze. Rain hissed softly around them. For a long breath, the world narrowed to that one heartbeat of tension. Then the rifle thundered. Wyatt's shot hit the mud inches from the man's boots, spraying dirt and water across his coat. The horse reared, snorting in panic. The man stumbled back, cursing as the others jerked their reins tight. "Go," Wyatt barked, his voice cutting through the rain like steel. "Tell whoever sent you she ain't here. And if you come again, you won't ride back." For a moment, the scarred man just stared at him, jaw tight with anger and shame. Then he spat, muttered something Wyatt couldn't hear, and yanked his horse around. "Ain't worth it," he growled. One by one, the men turned and rode off, the sound of their hooves fading into the ridge. Wyatt didn't lower his rifle until the last one disappeared into the mist. Only then did he exhale, breath heavy, the muscles in his arms trembling from restraint. When he turned, Taya was standing in the doorway, her shawl slipping from her shoulders. Her eyes were wide, not with fear, but something else. Something raw. She stepped closer, her hand rising to his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "You risked everything," she whispered. Wyatt met her gaze, his voice low and steady. "I told you I won't bury another." For a moment, neither spoke. The danger wasn't gone. It would come again. The world outside would not forgive what had just been done. But in the firelight reflected in her eyes, Wyatt saw something more than fear. He saw defiance. He saw choice. And for the first time in years, he felt he wasn't standing against the world alone. That night, the cabin held no words, only the steady quiet of two souls who had faced danger and refused to yield. Taya Moonfeather sat near the fire, her shawl slipping from her shoulders, and Wyatt Kane's rough hand found hers in the flickering light. The threat had come and passed, but the bond between them had been forged in the silence that followed the gunfire. Outside, the land was wet and scarred from the storm, but within those walls, warmth lingered. Two lives once adrift were now tied together, not by chance, but by defiance and choice. The morning after the riders had gone, the world lay still, the kind of stillness that comes after tempests and standoffs alike. Mist hung low across the clearing, the earth soft beneath his boots. Wyatt stepped outside with his rifle slung across his shoulder, scanning the ridge until he was certain no one lingered there. The men had been sent to take her. They'd failed, but fear like that never vanished overnight. Still, something in the way they looked back before disappearing told him the fight was done, for now. When he returned to the cabin, the fire burned low, and Taya stood by the stove stirring a pot of beans. Her shawl still draped her shoulders, but she moved differently now, her spine straight, her steps sure. She looked up when he entered, her expression unreadable for a moment before softening. "You didn't have to stand against them," she said quietly. "I did," Wyatt answered, setting the rifle beside the door. "Couldn't do otherwise." Her gaze searched him as if looking for something deeper in his words. Finally, she turned back to the pot. "If I stay," she said, slowly, "more will come. They don't give up easily." "Then let 'em come," he said, his tone firm but calm. "I've lived too long with nothing but ghosts for company. If I fall protecting you, at least it means something. I'm done burying and walking away." And she set the spoon down, her hands trembling faintly before she steadied them on the table. "You don't understand what it means to be the daughter of a chief," she said. "To some, I'm worth land, power. To others, I'm a way to break my people's spirit. You're one man, Wyatt Kane. They won't stop if they think I live." Wyatt stepped closer, boots thudding on the worn floorboards. He placed a hand on the table between them and leaned in. "I don't give a damn what they think you're worth. You're not a prize. You're not a bargain. You're here. I'm here. That's enough for me." Her eyes shimmered, not from weakness, but from the weight of hearing what no one had ever said to her before. For a long moment, silence filled the room. Then, in a low, certain voice, she said, "Then I will stay." The air in the cabin seemed to change. The words settled like stone. She had spoken her choice aloud, and with it all the shadows from the canyon finally lifted. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't waiting to be found. She had chosen to remain. Wyatt felt the years of tightness in his chest ease. The ghosts that had haunted his days loosened their grip. He reached across the table, and she met him halfway. Their hands joined, rough, meeting soft, steady, meeting sure. That day they worked side by side. Wyatt repaired the half-finished frame of the second room, the hammering ringing through the clearing like a promise instead of a warning. Taya swept the floor, cooked the meal, washed her dress, and hung it near the fire to dry. Each act was small, but together they spoke louder than words. They were building something, not hiding. By dusk, the cabin felt different, alive again. The walls seemed to breathe easier, and the silence between them carried warmth instead of emptiness. They sat close by the fire shoulders, touching. Her head rested lightly against his arm. Outside, the land was still damp, but calm had returned to the ridge. When Wyatt kissed her again, it wasn't born from fear or impulse. It was slow, steady, chosen. She returned it without hesitation, her hand resting over his chest, feeling the heartbeat that had carried him through war loss and years of silence. When they finally drew apart, their foreheads met, their eyes closed, breathing the same quiet air. "No more running," she whispered. "No more," he replied. The fire burned low, its glow soft across their faces, and the warmth between them stayed steady, unshaken. Outside, 2 graves still stood in the clearing, but they no longer marked only what he had lost. They now stood as a testament to what he had found worth living for again: dignity, memory, and the will to stay. At dawn, Wyatt stepped outside with Taya beside him, the mist lifted sunlight breaking over the ridge. For the first time in years, he didn't look for riders or storms. He looked at her. Her dark hair caught the morning light, her presence strong, certain. Whatever tomorrow brought, it didn't matter. The choice was made. 2 lives broken by grief had bound themselves together not by rescue or chance, but by choice. And as they stood before the wide-open land, Wyatt Kane and Taya Moonfeather began again. Not haunted, not hunted, but whole.